Coming from hush money payments to women claiming to have had affairs with Trump. This on the same day that federal prosecutors in New York revealed that tabloid publisher American Media, which is run by longtime Trump ally David Pecker, admitted that it had paid off Playboy model Karen McDougal ahead of the 2016 presidential election in concert, quote unquote, with the Trump campaign. President Trump reacted to the Cohen sentencing in a Fox interview Thursday.
What he did was all unrelated to me, except for the 2 campaign finance charges that are not criminal and shouldn't have been on there. They put that on to embarrass me. I never directed him to do anything wrong. Whatever he did on his own. He's a lawyer. A lawyer who represents a client is supposed to do the right thing. That's why you pay them a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera.
James Trusty is a former Justice Department prosecutor. He also served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Maryland, working under former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Welcome, Mr. Trusty. Appreciate your being here.
Sure.
So let me ask you, I guess the bottom line, what kind of legal jeopardy is Donald Trump in over these campaign finance violations?
Well, it's certainly not totally clear at this point, but it was not a great day for the president to see the language in the plea agreement and the language that's being used describing Cohen's activities. Now, you have to remember, every time a criminal defendant pleads guilty, they're pleading for themselves. They're not binding anyone else. The language in the plea agreement may be what the government hopes to prove or what they think they can prove, but it doesn't really directly mean they have admissible evidence or particularly practically usable evidence against the president. But it's a bad sign for him to see that kind of scrutiny by the Southern District.
Well, because the Southern District looks to me, and I've read those sentencing documents, and it looks to me like the U.S. attorney there is trying to show that, in fact, there was a campaign violation, that it was a crime, and that Donald Trump was part of a conspiracy to commit that crime. Is that how it looks to you?
Well, I think it reads that way. The question is really whether it's almost gratuitous, whether it's including it to kind of shoot across the bow of the president that they have at least an interest in exposing this information, or whether it's really part of an ongoing indictable case. And that gets down to, at least in part, the question of whether you could ever put Michael Cohen on a witness stand. And I think that's a real tough issue. His credibility is pretty well destroyed by that same sentencing memo, talking about how he doesn't even give up information about himself. But at the end of the day, there could be other ways to skin that cat. They may have a smoking gun email or a recording where they would barely have to rely on Michael Cohen as a witness if they were really building a case against the president.
And now they have David Pecker, who also says that he paid off one of the women, and he did it with the knowledge of the Trump campaign. Does that help a potential government case on the question of criminal intent?
Well, I don't know that the payments themselves are anything mysterious at this point. I think it's been common knowledge that all of these types of non-disclosure agreements happen. They may be very distasteful, but they're not illegal by themselves. I think the issue might well revolve around the president's intent. If he says
that's what
essentially,
I mean,
if he says essentially that I just sloughed this off on my lawyer, I wanted it to go away for a variety of reasons, that might be a very unattractive but valid defense. In other words, he's not specifically intending to skirt campaign finance laws. He's just trying to make something go away for family, for reputation, and perhaps for politics.
Well, and we have the precedent of John Edwards, the former Democratic presidential candidate and vice presidential nominee, who was indicted at one point for payments by his campaign donors to his mistress. But that was thrown out. Well, it was basically a hung jury, and then the Justice Department threw out the charges. And there's a real debate, is there not, about whether these payments like this to women are in fact criminal.
Right. I mean, again, non-disclosure agreements by themselves are not. It gets trickier as you start to get into campaign finance law to figure out where the funding comes from. But the intent question is a real difficult one. If you have to prove that the person willfully violated campaign finance laws, and they had essentially mixed motivations. They wanted to hide it because it was embarrassing, not just politically but personally. That becomes a real tough road for the prosecution, and I'm not convinced that that relying on Michael Cohen and inference is going to be enough to establish that kind of guilty knowledge by the president.
So what are the options here for the U.S. attorney? He's an acting U.S. attorney. Obviously, he works ultimately for the Attorney General, who works ultimately for the President of the United States. You and I both know the Southern District in New York is a pretty independent part of the Justice Department. But do they have an option to actually indict a sitting president? I know Justice Department guidelines say you're not supposed to do that.
Right. It's new territory for starters. I mean, the object of a prosecution is rarely immunized by class, but here there is a standing opinion from the Department of Justice, many years old, that says you can't indict a sitting president. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't indict it under seal and unseal it post-presidency. It doesn't mean they can't come all the way up to the very edge of indictment. And again, it's new territory. I can't think of a direct parallel that we've had where someone was that close to possible indictment by DOJ.
Well, what do you mean when you say could come right up to the edge of indictment? Do you mean that they could, if they had a future filing, say that the president is some kind of unindicted co-conspirator, something like that?
Well, they've all but done that in the Cohen statement of facts for sentencing. But, yeah, they could essentially build up their case, either indict it under seal and unseal it after the presidency, or if they're really feeling rebellious to Main justice, they could basically announce that they've indicted and see where the chips fall and invite the litigation that happens after that. That would be a really dramatic moment. Not predicting it, but it's certainly a possibility with the Southern District.
Well, but if they did that, surely the courts would side with the ultimate responsibility with the Attorney General. I mean, I can't imagine he wouldn't be able to give an order to a U.S. attorney.
Oh, no, absolutely. The Attorney General could do that. The question is how much of a full-scale rebellion do you have? I mean, the Southern District could essentially let it be known they have an indictment. The Attorney General could be put in a very uncomfortable position of saying we don't enforce indictments against sitting presidents. And, you know, there's probably no court appearance, but a few years later we'd sort out what that all means.
Yeah, it's an ugly political event. So, I mean, it seems to me that the likeliest outcome here, and we don't have a lot of time, but would be that all of this comes up to Congress as a potential item of impeachment if Democrats want to pursue this, and they bring Cohen up to testify and Pecker and so on. Is that what you think? Again, briefly.
I think the biggest worry the president has to have is that there's a report that's written that includes all of this campaign finance issue and turns it into essentially a blueprint for impeachment where you don't really assess the credibility of the witnesses, where you take the best hits of cooperators, even failed cooperators, put it on paper and read or write a story that's a pretty compelling read for people in the new Congress.
And then we'll fight it out politically. Thank you, Mr. Trusty. Appreciate your being here.
Sure.
When we come back, a federal judge orders Robert Mueller to turn over documents related to the FBI's questioning of President Trump's former national security advisor, as the FBI's tactics are called into question ahead of Michael Flynn's sentencing this week. His sentencing next week, a federal judge ordered special counsel Robert Mueller to turn over documents related to Michael Flynn's questioning by the FBI as new details emerge about that fateful interview, which led to criminal charges against President Trump's former national security advisor. Former FBI Director James Comey admitted in a recent interview that he personally made the decision to send a pair of agents to interview Flynn in 2017 and acknowledged the arrangement was not typical for dealing with a White House official.
Something I probably wouldn't have done or maybe gotten away with in a more organized investigation, a more organized administration, in the George W. Bush administration, for example, or the Obama administration. So if the FBI wanted to send agents into the White House itself to interview a senior official, you would work through the White House counsel, and there'd be discussions and approvals and who would be there. And I thought it's early enough, let's just send a couple guys over.
Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger and columnist Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. So before we get to the Michael Flynn bit, Dan, I want to talk about this, follow up on what you heard James Trusty say. Do you think that there's legal liability here for Mr. Trump on the Cohen payments, or mostly political?
That's exactly the question. It is a close call whether there's legal liability. What are we talking about? Campaign finance laws, right? It is a real law. People have gone to prison for violating it. I would suggest that the average American does not understand the campaign finance laws, and they would a lot of them would look at what's going on with Donald Trump and saying, this looks more to us like political retribution than trying to pursue somebody for breaking a serious law. And beyond that, if Donald Trump, as James Trusty was discussing, ends up actually getting indicted for trying to make a payoff to a mistress as a violation of the campaign finance law. Going forward, any president, I think, given the way campaigns are run, could be exposed and vulnerable to a political act like this.
You also have the John Edwards precedent,
Right.
which I think really militate against any kind of action
Right.
like this.
Yeah, in terms of a conviction, I mean, first of all, whether there would be an indictment, whether it would try to apply it before he leaves office or after, I don't think he's in legal jeopardy that way. You never know, right? But I don't think that's
Would
the
they even
concern.
impeach him, though?
Right.
The House impeach
well, the
him for
question
this?
is not just impeachment. If he were indicted, I'm sure, even if we're under seal, it would be leaked somehow that there's an indictment. It would be a factor in the 2020 election. I think the big problem is political. And look, the Democrats coming in, they're not the Democrats that we were promised when Conor Lamb was elected, right? The new moderate face. We've got a moderate agenda. They're in full resistance mode. They want to impeach. Whether they get enough votes is another question, but this could provide them the narrative they need.
I don't think they'll do that on this alone because it's risky for them. All right, Kim, let's turn to Michael Flynn. And you've been reporting on this. And the FBI's behavior in this is truly extraordinary. And to get that on the record, tell us what they didn't tell Flynn when they went in to interview him.
Yeah, it's deeply concerning. We know this because of documents that were filed by Flynn's defense team this week, and they gave us the circumstances that led to that meeting. We now know that it was set up personally by then Deputy FBI Director Andy McCabe, who reached out to General Flynn, all kind of buddy-buddy, said, hey, call in on other business, but while I'm on the phone, why don't we have some agents come over, sit down, and deal with this Russia thing? So it was designed to be very casual. Suggested that he not have a lawyer present, which General Flynn agreed to. These agents then show up and keep up that ruse. They don't tell him that it's a crime to lie to the FBI. They want him to be relaxed. They don't tell him that they have a transcript of his conversations. And the whole thing, Paul, it stinks a little bit of entrapment.
Well, yeah, I mean, and this, remember, what the timing on this was in January of 2017, so shortly after the president has taken office, and you get the sense with James Comey's acknowledgement here that, yeah, we tried to do this in a way that we couldn't have done with any other administration. That even that early in the administration, the motive here was to try to sandbag Flynn.
To get him, because think about how this might have rolled otherwise. You have a man who spent 33 years in military service, paratrooper, Army Ranger, rises up, decorated general, now the head of the NSA. You would think he would deserve the benefit of the doubt. What the agents might have done, should have done, is come in there and said, look, we have these, we managed to get these transcripts of your calls. There's some concerning things in here. Let's talk about it. Let's talk it through.
FBI officials thought that they told initially the Congress when they were testifying that they didn't think Flynn was lying.
Right. And look, the bigger picture of this, Kim's absolutely right. Compare this to the handling of the Hillary Clinton investigation. When she was interviewed by the FBI, I think there were 13 people in the room, all lawyers. They allowed Cheryl Mills to represent her, to be in the room. The handling is just incredibly different. It's hard to say this is honest. It seems that's the intent of the judge's question. What was the FBI doing? I wish the judge had asked for the entire FBI file to find out what they did at what time.
Well, that's right. I mean, people should not commit crimes. But it looks here as though Flynn's offenses are incidental to something larger, which is for the prosecution to figure out whether they can find a path to Donald Trump without quite knowing what that crime might be, Paul. And past some point, it stops looking like prosecution and more look like a persecution of the president.
When we come back, as lawmakers scramble to reach a budget agreement, President Trump says he'll take the blame for a government shutdown. So are the negotiations over border wall funding a preview of what's to come next year?
Criminal justice reform, as you know, we just got word that
a contentious meeting at the White House this week as lawmakers scramble to reach a budget deal before the Friday night deadline. President Trump meeting with Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer Tuesday, with the two sides still far apart on his request for $5 billion in border wall funding. The president saying he'd be proud to shut down the government over border security.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck, because the people of this country don't want criminals and people that have lots of problems and drugs pouring into our country. So I will take the mantle. I will be the one to shut it down. I'm not going to blame you for it.
We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Alicia Finley. So, Kim, certainly you could see Chuck Schumer smiling there. Looks like he actually
Big
was
smile.
delighted that President Trump took that responsibility. Was that smart for the president to do?
Well, probably not. Look, in any shutdown scenario, the number one question both parties care about is who takes the blame. And yeah, both Pelosi and Schumer were smiling there because the president willingly said he was going to take it. Now, I think the question, though, is how this does play out in the end. We've had shutdowns in the past where, under the Obama administration, they were designed to inflict maximum pain on the country. We would only be talking about a partial shutdown here, and I know that the Trump administration has been working very hard to make sure it happens with minimal disruptions.
So, Alicia, what's really at stake here? I mean, what are they fighting over in the end? $5 billion that Trump wants, $1.3 that the Democrats are offering, but it's for border security, build some of the wall. Is that it?
Supposedly, I think Trump is trying to show to his base that he's still taking to the Democrats on this issue and is not conceding even an inch. The irony here is that Trump had an opportunity back early this summer to cut a deal with Democrats for about $24 billion for border security in the wall in return for some modest cuts to family migration. Yes, as well as the DACA.
The Dreamers.
Dreamers, exactly, a deal for the Dreamers.
Legalizing
and he turned
them.
it down, both in the House, so there was a fringe caucus in the House that defeated it, but also in the Senate, a similar deal was cut, and he basically sabotaged it by issuing a veto threat.
So that so now he's essentially scrambling here in the final days of the Republican Congress, Dan, to be able to get something that he can say is what he wants, one of his main campaign promises.
Well, the reports we get out of Washington at the moment, Paul, suggest nobody's really scrambling. It's dead in the water.
Nobody's negotiating.
Nobody's negotiating. The Republicans and Democrats are not talking to each other. It all comes back to this event in the Oval Office where Trump made this statement. I will take responsibility. I love the phrase, I'll take the mantle. I love it every time he says that. But, you know, I've looked at that conversation about 50 times. And the issue is, well, the question is, what is the issue? Is it the wall or is it border security? Trump never says the wall in that exchange. He's talking about border security. Does he want money contributed to doing something about the caravans, or does he actually want money for the wall? That's, I think, where the debate is revolving at the moment. They've got to do something. The government is probably going to shut down on December 21st. The best they've come up with, the Republicans say, throw it off till January 3rd when Nancy Pelosi is House Speaker. Or maybe we'll just freeze the budget till October of 2019. They have no solution. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump didn't come forward at some point and come up with a figure for border security.
Well, I think Trump feels like he has to drive this, Kim, because when Nancy Pelosi takes over and runs the House, he has even less leverage.
Yeah, it's going to be even harder. And so there is a strong reason for Republicans to finish this and get something done. Of course, as the president said there, the real issue is the Senate. And we have to drill down. There are some different dynamics here. There are probably votes in the House to get President Trump largely what he wants in terms of border security funding. And so I watch this space. I think what you probably see is the House pass something late next week, send it over to the Senate and try to jam them there because everybody wants to go home for Christmas. That seems the most likely scenario. We'll see if that flies.
Pelosi complained at one point to Kim, that, to the president, that we should have this behind closed doors. But do you think this is the kind of way that Trump is going to try to govern with them next year? Maybe have some of these public sessions and debates where it's open and
I think he thinks that it plays to his advantage, but
why would that play to his advantage?
Well, I think that I don't think it plays to his advantage because he just came off as seeming actually quite idiotic in that scene.
It's a strong phrase.
Yes,
quite
it is idiotic. But it really plays into Democratic hands if he issues ultimatums that are completely absurd. In this case, I think it's debatable 1.3 billion, 5 billion. But if he starts making demands that, that Democrats will not agree to, that does not strike it as a compromise, I think that plays to the Democrats' advantage.
All right, thank you all. Still ahead, British Prime Minister Theresa May surviving a no confidence vote this week as the UK Parliament continues to grasp for a Brexit deal. We'll have the latest from London next.
Here is our renewed mission, delivering the Brexit that people voted for, bringing the country back together, and building a country that truly works for everyone.
British Prime Minister Theresa May surviving a vote of no confidence Wednesday after fears of defeat prompted her to postpone a vote in Parliament on her Brexit plan. The embattled Tory leader was back in Brussels Thursday, hoping to negotiate tweaks to the deal that might help her win support at home ahead of the March deadline for Britain's departure from the European Union. Editorial board member Joe Sternberg joins us from London with the latest. So, Joe, welcome. What is where does this stand now that Theresa May can't get her plan through Parliament and she can't get any concessions from the European Union? What next?
Right. Well, I think what is next is a really chaotic 3 months in British politics. I mean, to remind viewers of how we got here, I mean, there was this vote 2 years ago where the British public decided they wanted to leave the European Union, but, we just discovered that there are a lot of possible ways to do that. You can have different kinds of trade relations with the EU. You can, leave without any kind of trade deal in place. You can even try to stay in the EU. There's still a debate about that, aspect of the situation. And I think that what we've discovered in the past couple of weeks is that there is not yet a concession in the Houses of Parliament here in London behind any of the offers that would be acceptable to the rest of the 27 EU member states.
Right, but there is a date coming in March where the 2-year limit on the Brexit, the fuse goes off, and is there an increasing possibility that you could get a Brexit with no deal?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a growing risk. I mean, we are starting to see a little progress, and I have a little hope that we might start seeing some clarity on this. So first off, as we pointed out, Theresa May faced a challenge to her leadership from within her party this week. That was an important step because what they were really fighting about was her version of a Brexit plan versus a version that would be supported by a smaller number of Conservative members of Parliament. So I think that starting to vote on that kind of thing is helpful. And then also this negotiation that happened in Brussels this week is helpful because it's made clear that really what is on the table right now is the best offer that Britain is going to get from the rest of the European Union.
Well, but are you saying,
that's something
Joe,
people need to know.
All right, but are you saying, Joe, that if they don't come around to taking the Theresa May deal with the EU as it exists, then no Brexit will be the alternative?
Well, I think that there are going to be a couple options here. I mean, if they don't take the deal, they can continue with Brexit, and then it's going to be a hard Brexit without any kind of trade deal in place with the rest of the EU. The Parliament here can accept the deal that's on offer, or they can decide that they want to negotiate something that actually involves more free trade with the rest of the European Union, but that also requires more concessions from the UK. So, for example, you can have a very deep kind of trade relationship countries like Norway currently have from outside of the EU, but that's going to require some concessions in Britain too, and it's not really clear that people can agree on that yet either. All
right, let's talk about President Macron of France. He reversed himself on the fuel tax that he wanted to impose, pulled that back this week, contrite, made some other concessions to retrieve his position. Can he retrieve his standing and move ahead with his reform? Because he still has 3.5 years left in his term.
I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, my rule these days in Europe is that you never say never about anything, and I can imagine some scenarios where he might get some momentum back on his reform drive. But I think that what we've seen with these protests, it wasn't just about the fuel tax, it was about the sense that he was really trying to steamroll a lot of opposition there still is in France to a lot of parts of his reform agenda. He hasn't done a good enough job of the salesmanship that he needed to bring voters along with that.
All right, Dan, you wrote wrote about this week. What's the bigger picture here on the failure of European leadership?
Well, the bigger picture is that the European Union was formed in 1992, and now 25 years later, we're seeing cracks in the fabric. And the cracks are occurring at the leadership level. Yes, the British leadership, the British people voted for Brexit, but the leadership had no idea of the path forward. On the other hand, the European Union is beginning to look a little bit like its attitude is, we're Hotel California. You can never get out. You have to stay inside this labyrinth of rules that we've created. And I don't think Britain is going to be the last country to push back against that European unity, such as Italy, Spain, and the rest of them.
Bill, briefly, what's the U.S. interest here? What is at stake for us?
I think if Donald Trump were clever, this is an opportunity. Look, Theresa May said that she's going to renegotiate a deal for the Brexit people voted for. If she had given that, she wouldn't be in the fix that she's in. What they did was opt for Brexit without having a clear plan how we're going to do this. And one of the plans would be, I think the president needs to step in and offer to work out a trade deal with the UK, because we don't have that much discriminatory stuff against one another. So you could have a pretty clean trade deal and then say it's open to anyone who wants the same terms. And instead, we've kind of left them hanging.
Joe, what do you think briefly is at stake here for the U.S., and is that trade deal a good idea with the U.S.?
Well, I think a trade deal would be a good idea, but one of the problems that is bedeviling this process in the UK is that it's actually going to be much harder to get that deal than a lot of people in London thought it would be, because the US often insists on opening agricultural trade, which is an issue where Britain is actually very similar to the rest of the EU. So I think that it would be good for Britain to do the deal, but there's going to be this whole other political problem of whether they can get through the kind of deal that the Trump administration would be prepared to sign with them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. Still ahead, President Trump's sending another not-so-subtle message to his Federal Reserve chairman about interest rates. So what should we expect when the central bank meets next week?
The Fed won't be raising interest rates anymore, because if you compare us to, as an example, President Obama, he had zero interest rates.
President Trump sending another not-so-subtle message to Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell ahead of the central bank's announcement on interest rates next week. In an interview with Reuters on Tuesday, the president called a potential rate increase foolish and criticized Powell for being far too aggressive. So what should we expect when the Fed meets next week? Let's ask Jason Trenner. He's the chairman and CEO of Strategas Research Group. Welcome. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
So, lots of market turmoil. How solid right now is American growth and the economy?
I think that the American economy is quite strong by almost any measure. I think there is some slowdown in some of the interest rate sensitive sectors like autos and housing, but employment's quite strong, corporate profits are quite strong, business confidence and consumer confidence is quite strong. So I think the outlook is quite good going into next year. There are, of course, some headline risks that are in the market today that are probably impacting stock prices, but by the same token, I think the economy itself is quite good.
Well, then why the market turmoil? I mean, or why, putting it bluntly, I mean, the stocks are down for the year.
Yeah, listen, part of it is the stocks were up so much last year, so you probably built in some of the growth from last year into last year from this year, but I think also it's trade, it's the Fed. I think there are real questions about a potential policy mistake
on the part of the Federal Reserve, and I want to get to that. But what about trade? I mean, is the China negotiation, which is ongoing now, is that kind of hanging over the economy and the market?
I think it's hanging over the market particularly. There are some signs that it's hanging over the economy to a certain extent, especially with regard to capital spending. If we look at the Fed surveys of capital spending plans,
right,
they're up significantly from when the president took office, but they're down over the last couple of months, and I think that has something to do with the uncertainty surrounding trade.
Well, because the big selling point, or one of them, at least in my view, for the tax reform was that it was going to kick up capital spending,
yes,
and that had been so slow under President Obama. So that was going to make the difference and keep this expansion, which we know is very long by historical standards,
right,
keep that going. And you're saying trade is now an overhang on that?
I think it is, and I agree completely that the efficacy of these tax the tax cuts that were passed last year will be completely on capital spending. The people who designed the tax cut, as you know, are supply side economists, and they very much believe, as I do, that the key to long-term prosperity is productivity. Productivity is a result of capital spending and investment. So it is important, and it is important to understand that trade could have those things do not operate in a vacuum. Business confidence, even for large companies that have done very well in terms of corporate profits, long-term, knowing what the long-term rules are is extremely important in terms of making long-term investments.
Particularly if you're thinking about supply chains, right? Global supply
Precisely.
chains. Can you will be able to import from China with a zero tariff or with a 25% tariff?
Right.
Do you have to move to Vietnam? What about the NAFTA? Is that new NAFTA going to pass? All of those weigh on executive decisions.
Precisely. And I think, again, share repurchases are something that can happen at the moment. Those are something that you're seeing more of a bias towards companies to do share repurchases with the repatriated profits, with the extra cash flow. That's good for investors, but it's not particularly good for the overall economy. And I think that was one of the problems in the Obama years, in my opinion, is the policy mix was far better, candidly, for wealthy people at the end of those 10 years than it was for the average person. The average person that didn't have stocks and bonds got kneecapped as far as the interest on their savings. Stock prices went up dramatically, bond prices went up dramatically, and I think in many ways the Fed would never admit it, but I think is at least a proximate cause of the rise of populism in Donald Trump's election. I think so. It has to be careful. I think everyone has to be a little careful here. You've created something that should work. I think it would be better right now just for everyone to get out of the way.
All right, we got the Federal Reserve decision next week. They've been signaling they're going to put interest rates up another 25 basis points. Should they do that?
Probably not, in my opinion. I think right now the Fed funds rate is, the real Fed funds rate, the Fed funds rate minus inflation is about zero.
That's the low interest rate. That's
the policy rate.
Policy
That's a rate at which banks lend to one another. The Fed sets that rate, has an influence on that rate. It's now minus inflation is about zero, so it's probably low by historical standards, but compared to the rest of the world, our real Fed funds rate or real policy rate is quite high. And I think the Fed has to be very careful here because I think the best economists, somebody who runs an economics shop, the best economists are markets themselves. They're not people. They're prices, securities prices. And I think when you look at the yield curve, when you look at the performance of cyclical stocks, it's telling the Fed it should pause.
You're looking at commodity prices; those are down. You're looking at the inflation rate; that's been down.
That's right.
You're looking at the European and Chinese growth figures. Are those signals in your mind to hold?
I believe so, and I think Fed has to be quite careful because if you remember in the early part of 2015, at one point the Fed signaled that it was going to tighten 4 times. Everything went haywire. The dollar strengthened dramatically, emerging market stocks got hurt, credit spreads widened dramatically, and the stock market went down 15%. Ultimately, the Fed only tightened once. And so I think the Fed has to be careful here. I think Chairman Powell is a very considerate person. He's a markets person. He should take the message of the markets that is being given to him.
All right, Jason Trennett, thank you for being here. When we come back, the Supreme Court punts on Planned Parenthood, and 3 conservative justices rebuke Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts for ducking the controversial case. We'll have the details of this week's judicial dust-up next. Well, Supreme Court watchers looking for clues about the new conservative majority were offered a surprising one this week. The justices on Monday declined to hear a case on Planned Parenthood funding, with Chief Justice John Roberts and newly confirmed Justice Brett Kavanaugh siding with the court's liberals in not taking it up. That decision drawing a sharp rebuke from 3 of the court's conservatives, with Justice Thomas calling the decision troubling. In a dissent joined by Justices Alito and Gorsuch, Thomas wrote, quote, "So what explains the court's refusal to do its job here? I suspect it has something to do with the fact that some respondents in these cases are named Planned Parenthood." Thomas added that some tenuous connection to a politically fraught issue does not justify abdicating our judicial duty. We're back with Dan Henninger, Alicia Finley, and Bill McGurn. So, Alicia, you follow the court. You read the dissent. How do you explain it?
Well, this case actually does not involve abortion. It is about the private right of action for Medicaid patients to sue states in federal court to vindicate their quote-unquote right to their preferred provider, which in this case is Planned Parenthood.
And some states had banned Planned Parenthood from the Medicaid program.
That's right. They deemed them not qualified under their standards, and federal law gives them a lot of flexibility and discretion to do so.
Okay, so, and federal courts of appeal have been all over the map on this, right? There's a real difference of opinion about this private rights of action question.
That's right. It's split about 5-1. The Eighth Circuit is the dissent, the lone case where it has actually held that states or that patients do not have a private right of action. But the reason that circuits have been all over the place is because the Supreme Court's own rulings had been all over the place in the last 25 years. Okay.
And that's what Clarence Thomas said in his opinion. He said, look, we gotta straighten up our own act here.
Yeah, this is our job. We need to fix the mess that we created.
Right. So why wouldn't Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justice Kavanaugh want to take the case?
Well, I think they were worried about the politics of a potential ruling against Planned Parenthood.
Really?
Coming after, well, really, coming after these really contentious hearings, that it might be viewed as the conservative court is anti-woman. You can just see the liberals going crazy about this.
Well, but yet then it means that the liberal attack on Kavanaugh won because they basically would have said stand down.
Well, I think that's right, and that's really the danger of the court, ducking a lot of these cases, is that it really concedes to the left these points, these really important constitutional arguments in constitutional cases.
And we don't really know because, what the inside negotiations were at the court, but some people have inferred that this could have been a so-called defensive denial of hearing a case by Brett Kavanaugh if he thought Chief Justice Roberts was going to side with the liberals and they'd lose the case.
I hope that's the reason, for the reasons that that Alicia gave, because I think what's at stake here is whether the states are going to have this authority or whether federal courts are going to have this authority. And in that argument, I know there are different sides. I'd probably like the states. Look, the problem with all abortion-related cases is that they're abortion-related and it's a hot-button issue. Alicia's absolutely right. The substance has nothing to do with abortion, but you can bet that if this court ruled against the private right of action here, it's going to be portrayed, the headlines are going to be Kavanaugh moves court closer to overturning Roe. That's how it's portrayed.
Right, okay, but they can't duck this kind of thing forever. Sooner or later, this court is going to have to address these issues and that about abortion or gender issues.
Well, a private right of action, yes, and I think that I'm going to defend Brett Kavanaugh here, that the fear was that the four liberals were not going to rule against any case involving Planned Parenthood.
Well, that's for sure. We know where they would come out.
Regardless of what was at it.
We know where they would come out.
All right, and then if he had a fear that the Chief Justice Roberts, for reasons of his own, and I don't think it has to do with Planned Parenthood, but perhaps the private right to sue was going to establish that, he's going to say, let's fight another day on another issue, on another subject.
Well, what does this tell you? Chief Justice Roberts going to be the swing justice on this court?
I think he's going to. I think we saw that, or we've already been seeing that, in the Carpenter case last year, that he really is trying to make a quote-unquote consensus, but that may actually result in more muddled decisions in order so that he can bring some more liberals onto the decisions.
Battle for the heart and mind of Chief Justice Roberts. We have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week. Time now for hits and misses of the week. Kim, start us off.
So, Paul, a miss to House Democrats, namely all those so-called moderates who were elected in the midterms, as well as the so-called rebels who had all come together and said that there was no way they would vote for Nancy Pelosi to remain the face of their party. Well, guess what? Nancy Pelosi is going to be Speaker. She looks to have got the votes, and most of them are coming from those very people. They made a phony deal on term limits to give themselves cover to switch their votes, and she looks like she's going to remain in place. So the new Democratic Party looks a lot like the old.
Bill.
A hit to the Pacific Legal Foundation. They're representing a group of Asian American community organizations and families who are suing Mayor de Blasio, who wants to change the schools that are functioning in New York, these high-level 8 specialized schools, to change entrance from this single merit exam to something that would give more affirmative action and have a racial breakdown more to the mayor's liking. The problem is it comes up against the government's ban on discrimination by government entities. So this is like the Harvard case.
Alicia.
This is a miss to school districts that are now starting to ban homework. I feel a little bit like an old fuddy-duddy by saying this, but when I was a kid, we'd have 3 hours at least of homework every night. I think it helped build work ethic. And soon enough, when these kids are adults, they won't even want to start to work until afternoon every day.
Welcome to fuddy-dum, fuddy-duddy-dum here.
Well, Paul, I'm not sure whether this is a hit or a miss, but the people at Kentucky Fried Chicken have produced a Yule log, which you put into your fireplace, and it produces the fragrance of Kentucky Fried Chicken. I kid you not. But I think the possibilities here are endless. I myself would prefer a log that...
None of them good.
Oh, I would like the smell of a grilled medium rare hamburger. I have a relative who would like the fragrance of Cheerios. And I'm sure our viewers have their own thoughts on what kind of log fragrance they would prefer.
How about Christmas tree, maybe? Okay, and remember, if you have your own hit or miss, be sure to tweet it to